Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Chris Fuller. I am the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College in Maine. And this is our annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day event speaker that we host each year. So thank you for joining us. We hope you're staying safe and warm, especially if you're out here on the East Coast, given the recent weather events stretching from Florida all the way up here to Maine. So today, for our event this evening, we have a special guest with us, who is Sherine Green. And Sherine actually has a close connection to St. Joseph's College because she's one of our adjunct professors of theology with our online program. She's also co-author of the brand new, just released book, Awakening to the Violence of Systemic Racism. And that's why I asked her to join us this evening, is to talk about not just the book, but actually her experiences that kind of brought her to writing this book and wanting to share her experience and information with the rest of us and with the wider world. Sherine serves as the Director of Youth Faith Formation at Christ Our Light Parish in New Jersey. She's also the mother of 2 boys, and she's also an adjunct professor at Villanova University. She previously worked at Romero Center in Camden, New Jersey, where she developed retreats for high school, colleges, and parish groups around the country, immersive retreats. And after college, she immigrated from Jamaica to serve as a Mercy volunteer in Brooklyn. So she also has a close relationship with our Mercy charism. She has a passion for people and immersion and drawing people into experience and conversation. She has also spent time in Northern Ireland, and now she passionately invites her parishioners to such experiences. So welcome, Sherine. Thank you for joining us tonight and for sharing with us your experience and sharing with us a little bit about the book that you co-authored with Vince Gower.
Thank you so much.
So let's just begin with, I'm gonna stop our sharing here of the slides, and we'll get to them back in just a moment so we can share a little bit of the slides you prepared. But just to start the conversation, let's talk a little about yourself. Like I said, I introduced you as an immigrant here from Jamaica. And I know, having read the book, you've got a chapter of the book on you, kind of an autobiographical section of the book about your experiences. So why don't you just start with sharing us a little bit with us about yourself in terms of what is it about your life and your experiences that brought you to the point of putting this material together and putting this book together and wanting to get it out to the broader public.
Thank you so much, Chris. Once again, it's for me a pleasure to be here. It's nice to see some familiar faces or names on the screen of people that I've kind of collaborated with over the years. As Chris said, my story is in the book. It's chapter 10, The Power of Story. And it was an opportunity for me to look back at my own life to see kind of where my footprints landed me, the many places, the place where it started and to where it is today. So I guess that could be a good place in terms of, how this started. I was born in Jamaica. Some people are familiar with Jamaica, I assume, or if you're not, you're probably imagining warm weather at this point, 85 degrees. I grew up outside of Kingston, spent many years dreaming, hoping, seeing the United States because it was always on my television screen. I always had a chance to see the US and really see the imperfections of it, see the truest beauty. And it is a beautiful country in so many ways. And so that inspired me as a child growing up. I didn't expect in any way that I would be seated in this position that I am in. But certainly I dreamed, I guess for many people who are immigrants themselves, that dream of the United States and that dream of freedom, that dream of beauty, and the imperfections that we sometimes see thanks to Hollywood of the US. So that's a little bit of where I come from. I kind of segued a little bit, Chris, but can you help me to kind of get back on track?
Actually, one of the things I really found interesting reading the book was, in looking at the title and opening the book and reading the first couple chapters, clearly your goal is to awaken within your reader, right? The title, Awakening to the Violence, is to awaken within the reader, right? The kind of history of systemic racism in the United States, the kind of that 400 plus years from slavery up to the present. But when I got to your chapter, the 10th, you said the 10th chapter, I think I realized also it was kind of about your awakening to systemic racism, right? You're growing up in
Correct.
Jamaica, seeing what you saw around you in Jamaica, but also you described very nicely what you watched on the TV, also American programming, and the kind of
Mhm.
disparities you saw between what you saw on the TV and what you were experiencing in Jamaica as you were growing up. So maybe let's start there. How did those early experiences perhaps awaken within you, or start this journey towards awakening towards understanding racism, not just as individual acts, but the systemic nature of it?
Yeah, I'll go back to high school a little bit just to build a framework. And in high school, some of the literature books that we read were, To Kill a Mockingbird, which students still read today. Atticus Finch. People still love that character. Some of the books we read were really on point in shaping my perspective in terms of the U.S. and the laws and the policies and all that stuff that happened historically. But not till you get here, not till you meet people, not till you listen to their stories, not till you hear firsthand. You're no longer reading books at this point. For me, as a student learning in Jamaica, hearing those stories, it was different. For me, moving to the United States and getting a sense of, the struggles of people, being in New York City with the Sisters of Mercy, going into the projects and seeing the conditions in which people lived, hearing the stories of mainly African Americans and people of color. And some people may correct me quickly and say, do not call us African Americans, Black Americans, the story of people. And witnessing, that was transformative. That was shifting to me. It was no longer the stories that I was reading for a history exam or a literature test. It was the lives of people that were still in this very day and age affected by the policies, by the structures, by generational inefficiencies and deficiencies, which led to my awakening, my own personal awakening.
And in Jamaica, this is, you're right about your experience in Jamaica too. Something that we find in other cultures, people of color, which is also even within those cultures, the light skin, dark skin, kind of dichotomies, and how that also seeps into the culture, right? Can you explain a little bit about that in terms of what you saw in Jamaica and maybe how that shaped when you came to the United States?
That's amazing. You really read the book.
I did. Yes.
That's really cool. So this book was really self-reflection for me to think back of, the 80s, the 90s, the year, 2000s even, just how the implications of color affected people. If you were lighter skin toned, if a lot of people in Jamaica, our motto is out of many, one people. So there are all kinds of people there. And I see some Sisters of Mercy on here too. There are Mercy sisters there. They're all people from all over the world in Jamaica. And so people tend to intermarry a lot. So even my own ethnicity, I am a Jamaican by birth, but my mother's Indian and my father's Black and Chinese. It's very typical to have those connections, and so for us it's not a problem, even though there is a problem. We just don't address it. And what we realized over the years is that if you're a lighter skin tone, you could get a job in a bank. You would be promoted to a bank manager. You would be given certain privileges. If you're darker in skin tone, your chances of success would be less. Even the last name. So people's last names, some people still had like Irish or Scottish last name, and you could tell they were from some kind of success. Most people still have, due to colonization, very English names or Scottish names, but you could see where certain names will give you an advantage over migrating or over getting a position at a very important bank. And so I grew up witnessing this. I grew up knowing this. Of course, there were people who beat the odds because of their significant abilities or resilience, people who have done extraordinarily well in spite of, thanks be to God. But we noticed, we as a people, as my family, we knew this from the get-go. And it was almost like a race against life. Like, how are you going to position yourself? What kind of achievements will you fulfill? My own parents wanted me to be a doctor. That was their hope. That was their dream. Their retirement package was kind of packaged into me. Unfortunately, no. I've kind of changed course a little bit, but it's amazing just to see how skin tone and names have given people and features too. Like some people have because of intermarriages just had Caucasian features, or longer hair, texture. All of that gives people certain opportunities, which is very visible even today.
Mm-hmm. And so so you already had that experience in Jamaica. When you came to America, what did you experience with regard to racism? I don't know if this is the right way to phrase it, that was new to you or unexpected to you about coming here to America.
Yeah, so for me, I guess seeing the projects on TV, or learning about some of the historical setups from the get-go, for me, seeing a project in reality in Brooklyn, that was awakening. That was my own awakening. Going into the projects itself, I wasn't sure what I should believe. In our book, we talk about fear. And so when you think of African American people, oftentimes the stereotype is you see a person of color and they're sometimes seen as bigger or taller, or more athletic. You cross the street, you go on the other side. Well, being in a project where you're seeing 25 African Americans sitting down, um, listening to music booming from their boombox or whatever it is they were listening to, your automatic response is, well, what do I believe in at this point? What do I do at this point? You automatically begin to challenge your own stereotypes, your own biases, your own perspectives, your own preconditioned notion, and how do you respond? So I learned quickly that my response should be exactly what I was taught in Jamaica, and it is good morning or good afternoon. And perhaps that was my defense mechanism because I wasn't sure, based on what I had seen or what I've heard. As a person of color too, stereotypes also feed into the mind and feed into the perspectives. So I had to really rationalize, almost like a tug of war in my mind, as to these are my brothers or my sisters, and I'm in a safe space. And I noticed that even today. I live in Camden, New Jersey, and one of my neighbors reminded me 15 years ago. She said to me, you won't get hurt by any of our people here, she said. And that was like an eye opener for me, because it's my experience. My reality is, no matter how we've been told or trained, or the scary spaces that we've seen on television or we've heard of in terms of statistically, people are people, and people will always, no matter what, even if something terrible has happened in their experience or around, people always treat you with respect. And I've gotten that respect from African American men, African American women, and children. In the street where I live, I have a street name that the kids call me by. It's that respect, that's connection, with people, and seeing people as people. No matter, we are all different. We all come from different walks of life. I still listen to reggae. I'm still very Jamaican to the core, but at the end of the day, I am connected to people. When I lived in Ireland, I was part of the Irish connection. I was almost like molding yourself, not changing yourself at all, your DNA, your structure, your mindset, but being with people, getting connected, being with people, and not challenging your own stereotypes too, of what you think of people, of experiences, of places. Um, Almost like shattering some of your own perspectives, which is really hard.
You mentioned you spent time in Ireland, and you describe in the book that there the tensions were religious tensions, right, between the Protestants and the Catholics. Did
Mhm.
that experience help you at all in terms of breaking down prejudices? In terms of, again, you're thinking about this topic of eventually coming to writing about not religious differences, but racial differences and racism in particular.
Absolutely. Ireland, I had no idea that would have formed so much. I had no idea what my journey would lead me to, and I still have no idea where my journey is leading me. But I was truly and forever will be grateful for Northern Ireland. One, the children would all come up to me and they would, rub their hands on my skin and they'd say, we're so different. And explaining just differences, but also seeing similarities was key for me to help our little children there understand. Some are still in contact with me. They're all getting married at this point. They're having their own children. I've kept in touch with a few. But having us realize that no matter who we are, where we come from, our identity is in God. And that's most important. I think that was key for me to help bring to the awareness of the children that I worked with on the playgrounds every day, and also to myself, to remind myself that we are different. There's so many different people in the world, but in spite of that, we're all in God, created for oneness, created for goodness. And that has also been part of my mantra in terms of the work that I do now. I work mostly with children who are now second, third generation Irish families from Irish immigrants. And sharing that story has been really good for me in the work that I do, whether I'm in an African American community working with youth or working in my parish, which is mainly, well, very, very diverse parish, but mainly Irish Italian community as well.
So what do you hope the reader, what do you hope to awaken within the reader with this book?
That's a very good question. What do we hope to awaken? My co-author is Vince Gallagher. And for Vince and I, we've had these conversations for the last, I don't know. Okay, it's Chris's internet listed. I think for the last 10 years, Vince is a speaker at the Romero Center. The Romero Center is a place that hosted St. Joe's for a few years for their retreats, for their service immersion. I see Frank is on here. And so it's a place where we bring students to examine the context and the cultures of our society, the culture rather of our society, to break apart, to kind of see where we are and to see what's happening in society, to bring together that mission of transformation. But transformation don't just happen overnight is what we've realized. And so it's by seeing with the eyes, and sometimes the eyes rob us of an opportunity to truly see. So perhaps seeing with the heart. The heart helps us to feel. That's where the connection of mercy comes in for me. I was just asked by a pastor the other day. He said, I don't understand this social justice stuff. And I said, well, I get it. But the key is really mercy. The key is mercy. So whether we're talking immigration or we're talking, racism, or the key is mercy. Who are the people that are marginalized? Who are the people that are being affected? And so if we can't see with our eyes, because in front of us, it's here, I understand everything is nicely set up in most of our circles, and life can be good. Life is good, but when we've never had a chance to see the projects, for instance, or to walk through the trenches of society, or meet an African American family that's never owned property in their entire life, never even dreamed of it, can't even dream of having their kid graduate high school, can't even dream of owning or having a decent job. That to me is where I have to see with heart. And so the book is hopefully an opportunity for us to be awakened emotionally, for us to position ourselves and not intellectually process this. There's a lot of intellectual stuff in the book, but my part was really to look at the reflective piece, to ponder, to look at it through the lens of scripture, the gospels, our faith, our traditions. Where does heart meet us in what we see in the suffering and the struggles of others? And so that's my call, that's my challenge, that's my plea. That's what I hope to awaken in my own self, because I too can be distant. I too can be, even as a person of color, be blinded by superficial life that we see, that we hope for, that it's there for us to enjoy. But the truth is, not everybody get a piece of that experience. And so heart comes into the mission. Mercy becomes the saving grace for us to see.
Thanks. I'll add to that is to encourage people to purchase the book, which is each chapter ends with a helpful quote from Catholic social teaching, questions for reflection about people's own understanding, or their, like you said, you ask great questions like, have you ever visited the projects? Do you have any Black friends? Do you, a whole host of questions, I think, really do a good job of helping us elicit within ourselves ways in which we might have been shaped by systemic racism that we're not recognizing. My very first encounter, when I reflect back on my life, exactly you talk about the way in which I think we're shaped by, unconsciously by threat. I was a graduate student. I was in Berkeley, California. I was walking home one night to get on the train, the metro to go home, BART. I was reading a book and not paying attention what was around me. And I noticed in my peripheral vision, someone coming towards me, and I kind of moved, swerved to get out of the way. And the person called me on it. He said, "Did you just get out of the way because I'm black?" And I didn't think I did. But as I reflected on it, I wonder if I had. I wonder if I had been shaped in the very way you're describing about something subconsciously assumed threat and moved out of the way. And I'm always grateful that he confronted me for that, because I wasn't aware of those habits, perhaps, that had shaped me in some ways. You mentioned, obviously, how your faith plays a role in addressing and approaching this topic. So I'm going to pull up some of the slides you prepared here for us so that we can talk about the ways in which your Catholic faith is part of the way you've approached this and the way you've put the book together.
Thank you.
And if anyone has questions for Sherine, we'll make time towards the end for questions, but also you can pop them into the chat box here. And we'll also use those as questions for part of this conversation. So I'll hand it over to you, Sherine.
Oh, thank you so much. So, being at the Romero Center, a place that hosts high school, college groups, parish groups, I was there 8 years ago, and I spent 8 years of my life there. And right before that, I was a Mercy volunteer. In my experience, what I've learned to do is to talk to people, get a sense of where they are, kind of get a sense of what is their understanding, and also to listen to folks, because people are at this from different levels. For me, the most fascinating experience is talking about race to children, to young people. And so if you talk to a group in Camden, for instance, of mostly African American, am I frozen?
Nope, we can hear you.
Oh, looks like I was frozen there. Mostly African American students are young people. You'll get a sense as to their experience. If you are to talk to a group of, say, mostly white children, youth, young adults, you'll get another experience. My skill sets have been to bring people together to talk about the kingdom of God, together in one space, together to talk about, what does God hope for us? What does God desire of us? Well, firstly, friendship, connection, bridge building. If we're aware of the struggles that others face, we're more likely to respond better. If we know that people are in need, people need better jobs, people need just $1 more of increase in their salary, we would perhaps respond better. We would know not to judge the communities people come from. We would understand that $2 more on someone's weekly paycheck could afford them the chance to buy paint, so they could paint their street, so they could put a garden in front of their house, versus us saying, or judging, or saying, that place is terrible, stay away from there. So the kingdom of God, I think for me, my understanding is that we're here to awaken to the kingdom of God that is before us and within us, and to grow in love and to care for one another. Because when we care, it goes beyond racial divide, it goes beyond political divide, it goes beyond all the things that we use as human beings to separate us. It gives us an opportunity to be God's reflection in the world, God's hand and feet. St. Teresa of Avila comes to mind here, but the hands and feet of Christ. Okay, do we want to flip through, or do we want to... Okay, so the power of prayer. I'm not going to read slides. I've learned very quickly not to read slide word for word, because you then start to lose people. But the power of prayer gives us a chance to really sit with the discomfort, to sit with what you notice, what you hear, the protests. The 2020 was terrible. For Black people, for white people, for brown people, all the people. 2020 gave us a chance to see our reflections of something terrible. And I pray that through seeing that, our younger people will be willing to have conversations that are fruitful, that are not divisive, that we can come together and, maybe next slide, Chris, through that prayer, be willing to create love, be willing to see that at the core of who we are, we're made for love. And we can't really love people unless we understand their struggle. We can't understand people unless we get to know people. I would get to know their stories, get to know who they are, get to know, what are the situations behind their own struggles. So we can skip to the next. Because love requires understanding. Thich Nhat Hanh is one of my favorite. I know if I asked our audience here to raise their hand, anybody a fan of Thich Nhat Hanh? Buddhist monk, yes, thank you. So just that peacemaking, right, without understanding. I think it always comes back. The book Awakening takes us back to the perspective of understanding. If I understand what your pain is, a doctor will say, then I can help you. A doctor cannot just simply medicate. Otherwise, what are they medicating? They need to understand, they need to research, they need to ponder, they need to process, they need to get together, doctors together, to see what the issues, what the complications are, and then respond together with understanding. You can see our next slide. So today, as we celebrate Martin Luther King, one of the most phenomenal leaders in my perspective, we're given a chance to be guided by some of the perspectives from MLK in today's day and age. We're called to really look at some of the quotes from him and to kind of ponder, where does this fit into our lives and into our world now? You can see our next slide. Thomas Merton, another, when I worked at the Romero Center, there was a priest, Father Bob McDermott, another priest, Larry DePaul, who were just big fans of Merton. I had no idea who Thomas Merton was. Growing up in Jamaica, even I didn't study much Catholic theology. I didn't have that opportunity, but I did study at an evangelical seminary, and that's what opened me up to the chance to travel, which was kind of my visa, my passport. I did get the mission award and all of that. So I come at it from like the back end of things, the experience first, and then the studies later. But Merton's reflection here is fascinating. If you've never read this Louisville, Kentucky reflection, I think that is key for us to see. If only everyone could realize that we're not separate, that we're together. We're all, hopefully COVID-19 has taught us that we're getting through this together. Fratelli Tutti is a reminder of that. We're getting through this together, Pope Francis has said, not by ourselves, but as a community in solidarity. So we can look at our next slide. Martin Luther King Jr. called us to be love struck with each other. Now that's a tough one. Cornel West says to be love struck. Think of what that means. Like, how are we? I asked my 5-year-old, I'm like, what does love struck mean? And he says, Mama, to see with heart. I said, do you see heart for anybody? He says, yeah, of course. You? And he says, some of my friends in class. And so to be love struck means that you're going to see with heart. Maybe not as he's describing it as a 5-year-old, but to feel and to respond. To be love struck is to care with deep compassion, to be concerned with the poor and vulnerable. We can apply that to any marginalized group and to ourselves as well, to be love struck by our own passion and our own compassion. We can switch to the next slide. Hopefully I'm not too frozen. I know I'm kind of frozen here, but we're keeping it going.
You're good.
I am good. Okay. All right. Some of the questions that we asked in the book, my colleague Vince Gallagher, 75-year-old Irish Catholic man, started asking these questions himself. And so he said, is your church community integrated? That was one of the questions he asked. But he went further into asking some of the questions. Have you ever been to an African-American party, for instance? I ask groups sometimes, what does your Facebook page look like? Who are the people that you call friends? Not calling anybody out. You don't have to answer, not judging. But even for me, like, I'm intentionally making sure that I am aware of different people. I am aware of, the gifts, not seeing people as marginalized, because oftentimes that rob people of their dignity, but seeing the gifts that people bring and lift those gifts up and challenge our own stereotypes. So those are some of the questions that we asked. Have you ever held an African-American baby in your arms? Well, now with COVID, we're not really doing that. I understand. But one of my greatest joys being at St. Joe's Pro Cathedral in Camden when I left Mercy Volunteer Corps to work at the Romero Center was seeing people just pass their babies around in church. For me, that was beautiful because you would hear The music and the liturgy was so rich, and you would just see someone's baby being passed around and people just embracing. So just something that I don't always see, and that struck me. So just being mindful of people in our circle, people we embrace, people we lift up, and we lift each other up in through gospel values. We can look at the next slide. This is a terrible picture. I did not choose the picture. It's somewhere here in our book, or it could be on our slide. But Vince and I found it as something that was heartbreaking. Sometimes when we do this kind of work, our hearts have to be wrenched open. For some of the youth that I work with, for some of the young people, they sometimes think they know it all, or they understand things academically, and that's good. But not till you look at this, as defeating as it looks and as terrible and oppressive, then you can pay attention to emotions. For me, that's key, paying attention to how one feels, what is this being described in this picture, and what has left you almost, I don't know, paralyzed is perhaps my word of thinking. Let's move on. So Catholic social teaching. Without faith, where do we go? I sometimes wonder, like, how do you treat oppression if there's nothing rooted in faith? How do you treat marginalization? How do you treat anxiety or fear, even if there's not something to hold on to? And so faith becomes key. Listening to U.S. bishops, seeing the bishops speak up about dialogue, about the importance of life, about the importance of reconciliation, of bringing people together. How can we restore a respect for law and life is key. Mercy, responsibility, justice. I hope to hear this more in our homilies. I hope to hear the U.S. Catholic bishops speak more to this. I hope our universities will speak more to this, and I thank St. Joe's for being a witness to this reality. We could just skip through a little bit. Haitian proverb. Vince, my co-author, goes to Haiti every year, and for him, that was his own awakening, to see through the lens of God the suffering of people, and to see not just people in a struggle, but the joys and the gifts that people bring. So we can keep going. And this is just some discrimination statistics in Philadelphia. Chris mentioned that I also teach at Villanova. So I teach at Villanova a course called Faith Reason. And one of the things that I love to do is to drive through Philadelphia from Camden. And if you're familiar with the area, you're probably familiar with, just driving City Line Avenue and seeing just the development and the progression. So main line, very nice. And then as you go down main line, you see differences and disenfranchised people and poverty just by housing structures, poor housing structures. And so the book will hopefully give you a chance to question that a little bit more as to why that's so, or hopefully we'll have you asking some more deep-rooted questions.
Yeah, if I may, one of the things I appreciate about your book is I think that very often white people, I include myself in this, right? I think that we say yes, I'm against racism. Racism is wrong, but we tend to think of it as isolated incidences. There were slaves, and then there was Reconstruction, and then there was Jim Crow, as if they were separate things. And then we passed laws and made all that illegal. And one of the things I appreciate about your book and the information provided is the analogy I thought of was systemic racism. If I use a financial analogy, systemic racism as the compound interest of events layered on top of each other that have resulted in what we see today, the statistics that you point out, statistics like this, right? But this is not an isolated thing. This is interwoven with these 400 years, 150 years of layering of different kinds of policies, some of them intentional, some of them the unintentional participation of people in the kind of system as it's been set up. And I think for me, using this analogy, awakening again, for me, that was the transition from the seeing racism as isolated acts that bad people do, to seeing systemic racism as the accumulation of events and policies layered on top of each other, creating these structures. What have you found in your work with people helps them make that transition, right? From the racism is bad bad people do racist things, to systemic racism, as a structural structures that still are with us, that we need to be more mindful of and be better aware of.
Yeah, I would say to my students, for instance, I'd say people are not evil. The structures that have been set up were set up for personal growth, for one's well-being. So slavery in itself, though in my honest opinion was evil, the people who masterminded it was they were only thinking of their own progression, their own safety, their own development. And so we kind of make decisions that way, right? So we make decisions on we make our decisions based on our family. We make decisions in terms of how can we do better economically to provide for our families. I'm at the point where I'm doing that now because I have two boys. And so people did that. We see where companies grew. Like if you read the story of Chase, Morgan Freeman, the development of such a company was really for growth, for economic growth. And we've seen where it's boomed significantly. But we see today where if we're addressing it, if you're going to talk about like, schooling, our schools were set up. People say Georgetown, for instance, was built by slaves. And so people say, well, that's of the past, right? But Georgetown is making it right now. They're trying to bring in more students of color. They're trying to make it right. And that's good. But if you think of different structures that need to be examined, for instance, I just applied for a mortgage. So we have a home here in Camden, which I bought when I first moved here. And then now, because our boys are getting older, we need to be closer to the school, which is where I work. We just got a mortgage on another home, right? And so now we're thinking the process in itself is difficult, but it's almost like you have to prove yourself. For all of you here that have purchased a home, you have to prove yourself, right? We were fine. My family were fine. We were able to prove ourselves. We got the mortgage. We have a second home now. Thanks be to God. And so our kids can get to school. Well, one kid is in school. The other isn't yet. Or we're still trying to, figure things out as we go. When you think of the mortgage industry, and you think of, African-American people who don't even, some, not all African-American people are marginalized, and I'll point that out right away. But you think of if you don't have the required documents for anything, like what are your chances of success? You think of generational wealth, which many white people have accumulated over the years. You think of generational wealth because, if you're a grandfather or grandmother here, you're probably going to want to leave something for your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. Well, if you're poor and you've had to deal with slavery, you've had to deal with, the implications of the Jim Crow laws, and you've had to deal with redlining, and you've had to deal with all the issues that have complicated the process of you moving on. Even in preschool, we talk about this in the book. African American children of color, are treated differently in a lot of our schools. And I'll tell you that for a fact that I've seen it. They're treated differently. They're seen as difficult. They're seen as demanding, and so their chances automatically gets blighted because of the way they're treated or mistreated in a classroom, which prevents them from moving forward. So the structure in that needs to be examined. Not that teacher is terrible, but that teacher somehow doesn't understand that kid did not eat breakfast this morning, perhaps. That child did not sleep in a warm bed because they couldn't afford their heat bill. That teacher needs to be educated. So when you think of the structures, it's not because people are really evil. It's because we're being misinformed, or we only have half of the story. We've been given not the full picture. We probably haven't been in a project ourselves to have that awakening, that terrible awakening as to how people are living today, how people are treated today, and why is that so? So for me, that becomes the why.
Becomes internalized by the youngsters. Yeah.
Yes. So processing that a little in terms of the structures of society. Where is that? Where do we see that today? Well, kids of color will tell you they see it. They hear it. And so how do they respond? A lot of our kids in Camden, what they'll do is they'll put on a protective mechanism, and they'll become exactly what society says that they should be. They'll be the image that's being expected of an African-American boy or girl. And that robs them once again of a dignity to get into that bank and to get that mortgage, or to speak a certain way for that job interview. So once again, image is everything, and we're seeing where we see where Amazon movies, for instance, or Netflix have changed the way we see TV. I'm reading Betty White's book right now, audiobook. It's really incredible because we're seeing where TV has changed from the 1920s to where we are right now. So we're questioning, we're positioning ourselves to really consider, like, what are some of those things that rob people of their dignity? But you can't really ask the question if you don't know what it is, if you're not aware. And so awareness brings us to an awakening, and awakening brings us to awareness.
That's very good. Again, one of the things I like about your book is some of the data in your book. It's not just past data, it's present data, right? That
Exactly.
still today, children of color are more likely to be disciplined than white children, oftentimes for the same behaviors, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your
So,
children can get away. An African American child cannot conduct him or herself the same way as a white child can. And it pains my heart because I have two brown boys, and I know for a fact. I know, like skateboarding in a parking lot. There's a Whole Foods parking lot here in Cherry Hill, and I see white boys all the time skateboarding, flipping right in front of your car, doing all these dangerous things. And I'm the first one to say, call them out. I'm like, stop doing that. That's dangerous. Number one, I'm a youth minister. I'm able to do that, I think. I haven't been yelled at by them. They generally say, okay, I'm sorry. But the sad part is, I just think if those were boys of color, it would be a different response. The police would be involved. They'd probably be carted away with handcuffs. And we're told, nah. Some people would say, no, Sherine, that's not true. You're making things up. But the sad reality is that is the truth, which I've seen and experienced as well.
So one final question from me, Sherine, if you don't mind, then we'll open it up to questions that people might have here who joined us. Because the earlier slide, you had this series of questions that you said some of them came from Vince's own experience. And one of them had to do with our own church communities, right? That is,
correct.
Is our own church community integrated? It made me think of Dr. King's very last sermon. He made a comment that if we looked at Sundays, it was probably the most segregated day of the week. This is in 1968. And so in terms of that, if we were to really take an honest assessment, if we were to go to our parishes and ask that question, is our church community integrated? And we were honest about that, I'm sure most of us would probably say, no, they're not. Again, from your experience working in a parish setting, do you have any advice for how then people might say, okay, so what do we do? Like, we've acknowledged this truth. We've acknowledged that we are not an integrated community. We've acknowledged we're a predominantly, say, white community. What do we do? What then do we do next? Or what should we be thinking about as the next step?
Yeah. So it breaks my heart to see just the way we are structured here in Camden County. I'm from the Diocese of Camden. And Camden City in itself, mainly people of color. For them, church is one space. And then I think of the suburbs where we have different communities where for people in the suburbs, mainly white people who are Catholics. There are people of color in the suburbs. Let me just make that clear. But most times you're not Catholics. And there's a reason for that. But the truth is, we need to examine the why behind this. So we know kind of why this is happening. But then we have to move forward and say, well, how? How do we bring the body of Christ together? Because for me, one of my most shaping experience was going to the LA Congress a few times and seeing the body of Christ come together as people with many languages and abilities and traditions. And for me, that was just so rich. My parish did that. And so we came back to New Jersey saying, well, how can we create, because it's not like they're not people of color, Asian people, indigenous people, Black people. There are all kinds of people around us. Like, how can we be more welcoming? How can we accompany? How can we encounter? How can we use all those fancy Catholic words that we know well and experience that tradition and make this meaningful in our lives, to experience communion, to experience God's manifestation through people? And so I would ask people to say, well, start to think of the application. How could you do this? How could you make this a reality? For us at Christ Our Light, In my experience, we did something really cool a few years ago. This is pre-pandemic. I'm not sure how we could pull it off now. We probably could, but maybe through different ways and getting creative. We invited through Catholic Charities refugee families to our parish, and then we invited our youth. And what we did was we had one big communal dinner together. And once again, this is pre-COVID, but there are ways around this even at this point. We gathered, we prayed, we sang, and we met with meals. We met each other with meals. We didn't see each other as deficient in any way or oppressive in any way. What we saw were simply people, and we had that kumbaya moment, is what my youth group called it, where we experienced. And then after that, we were able, meaning my youth and I and some of our parishioners, were able to process this a little bit deeper as to, well, what did we get out of this? And how can we bring more initiatives such as this into our parish? Another initiative was, there is a parish in Camden which they have an asphalt ground as their parking lot / playground. What we did a few summers ago was each summer we would go and spend time with the kids there. And our kids in the suburbs were introduced to all kinds of things like cornrows. They were introduced to, being asked some of these very same questions that's in the book. But we were able to invite the kids from Camden to Cherry Hill to play on our grass. Simple idea, right? So lush green grass, which we don't really use that much. Have ice cream, play ball. I'm thinking of Henry now in here. Let people know you not just like them, but love them, and manifest God through those connections and through those interconnections. So those are just two things that we've done. There's several other things we've done as a parish, but two things that for me were most important. We've kind of dropped the ball now with COVID, and that's not an excuse, but I guess maybe that's a conversation to continue. Like, how can we continue to bridge the divide of people, especially now? How can we bridge safely? I'm going to use the word safely, those divides.
Box. I will pull up your slides here again.
Okay.
And you can share anything else you'd like about some of the information from the book, or send your thoughts and reflections on what you'd like to, how you'd like to move forward with the work that you've done.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I hope this is helpful for people. Like, obviously it's not a secret, right? Most people on here, some of you I know personally, as you walked in, it was a relief. This is not an easy subject to speak to as a woman of color, just so you know, just to be clear. I would generally give Vince Gallagher, my co-author, the chance to go speak. And he's been actually attacked by groups when he presents the subject. One of the most remarkable experience he shared with me was being at the Romero Center. There was a group that was accompanied by a lawyer, and the lawyer was the father of a child, a high school student. The group was from Massachusetts. That's all I know. And apparently the subject did not go over right with this parent. And there was, in order to examine this context once again, I go, both Vince and I, the subject of the heart. We must connect at the heart. We must see not only with our eyes, although our eyes can be deceiving, but also with our heart. We can't speak to a subject if we've never experienced it, or if we've known nobody that's experienced racism in any form. And so, get to know people, get to know their stories, get to know what those disparities are. I see Jacob is asking a question, my wonderful student. How do you think faith and activism is different than secular activism? Do you have an example from your own experience? All right, theology student there. Do you think faith and activism is? Absolutely not. What I love about Catholic social teaching, which is church teaching, it's regarded to as our best kept secret, but it's really not. We're coming out of the limelight that faith, the gospel, the message of the gospel was to speak to things with clarity, and to respond where needed. So activism, there's no, in my opinion, secular activism or spiritual activism. Like, it's all matters of justice, matters of the heart, matters of mercy. So like I said to the priest who did not understand justice, he said, I don't understand social justice, Sherine. I said, well, it's mercy. And if people are hungry, you feed them, but you also need to find out why are people hungry. And so you need to lobby for policies to make sure that people are fed. Otherwise, you're going to keep throwing $5 at them. And Martin Luther King regards that as flinging a coin at the beggar. So do we want to keep flinging a coin at the beggar, Or do we want to respond by making sure that this beggar never comes back to us for money again? This beggar may start their own foundation so that people will be fed. So that's my understanding of that.
If
Whoa,
I
the
may add
questions
to that,
are.
if I may add to that, in terms of the conversation taking place right now around racism, systemic racism, is there something that you think that Catholics bring to the conversation that adds to the conversation? That if Catholics were not part of this conversation, something be missing. And what would that piece be that's missing to the broader conversation, whether it be with religious people, non-religious people, just the broader conversation about racism that's taking place right now?
So first of all, it's amazing to see the response that I'm going to use Jacob's wording here. The secular world has taken on. It's amazing to see. There's a hospital by us. It's a Jefferson network, like Jefferson putting it out clearly on their front lawns where they stand. The church. This has always been part of who we are as church. We've always stood with the oppressed, the downtrodden, people who are being victimized. We know there's the issue of racial injustice. We know languages like reconciliation, words, which are very meaningful to our tradition, and it's part of who we are, part of our Catholic DNA. Now we just need to echo it clearer. We need to broaden the lens of people. We need to eliminate ideas that prevent us from really using mercy as a guide. Well, people will say, well, that's Marxism, or people will say that's political, or, and I'm the first one to say I'm not from this country. So please do not regard any of that as a distraction from what the actual issue is. There are people enslaved, if I must say that. And so how do we create redemption? How do we create communion? How do we become bridges of understanding in our churches? Even if it's an all-white church, how do we become bridges of understanding? How do we bring transformation? So hopefully that helps to.
Yeah. Thanks. And there's another question here about, does the book take into account, or in what ways, or does it take into account at all, critical race theory, which is a hot topic these days of conversation around this topic of racism?
Yeah, so the book, I mean, that's one of the questions that Vince was asked, which went into a very hot button topic. It's being discussed everywhere. And so that's what led to the confrontation between him and this lawyer, which I'm not sure if Vince will speak to another group based on what happened. So for me, Awakening takes into consideration that, but I want to stay away. For me, I want to hold on to what it means to be awakened. To be awakened brings awareness. If we're aware, then that brings us to that message of heart. That brings us to the message of grace. That brings us to mercy. And to help people understand, because what happens is with certain terminologies and certain happenings, people automatically politicize perspectives, and that's not what it is. It is a human matter that's happening now. So that's kind of where I am. I also see Kareem.
Yeah, Kareem has posted a comment here about being frustrated when someone says, "No way, it's not like that today." And I can be honest and say, I used to be one of those people. And my wife is a dark-skinned Mexican-American woman. And part of my awakening has been having to be honest about the things she experiences that I didn't think was a big deal, because I didn't see the patterns. I thought these were one-off experiences because I never had them. So they must have only happened once to her, when in fact they happen, like being asked, "Where are you from?" But being asked, "Where are you from?" over and over and over and over again. And only being asked, we've lived in 3 states, 2 of them predominantly white, and it's only in those states that she's been asked that question of "Where are you from?" So how do you answer that question if someone says to you, when you're talking about this topic, and you're talking about things like what's happening today, right? The incarceration rates, what's happening in schools. And if someone says, "No way, it's not like that today," how do you address that comment?
Thanks be to God. Kareem, thank you for that comment. Thanks be to God, I've had the opportunity to see things that I never prayed of seeing. I didn't hope to see. But when somebody says to you, "No way, it's not that way today," then you just simply go back to, well, in my experience, this is what I've seen happen to Mary Jones, or John Brown, or whoever it is. I noticed that was the experience. And so it doesn't become like this large group of people that you're talking about. It becomes, this is what I saw from my experience. Now, you can't tell me that I'm lying, and they can't tell me that that's not my experience, because how can you do that? That would just make you foolish. So I've learned to speak from the heart. I've learned to speak from my own experience. And so what you notice in this book, hopefully, when you look at it, the chapters, it is, the questions are geared to help you to question your own questions, question in the question, and to help you to understand that your experience is completely different, but it's not wrong. People who do that, sometimes it's just because their vision is blocked, their eyes are closed. And so together in conversations like this, we become spiritually aware. We're able to awaken through the Holy Spirit, not through anything that I say or do, but through the Holy Spirit. People are given an openness to begin to see with heart the struggles of others.
Yes, and as I shared, I think that I once thought my experience must be the same experience that everybody has, right? That everyone must have grown up the same way I grew up. And it's only later I realized that was not the case at all. And again, as you said, my eyes were opened by having to be honest about the assumptions I was making about my wife's experience, and then through her, the experience of other people that I met as well. So,
yeah, I see
yes,
Jackie also has a question.
yes. Jackie wrote that she's been listening to Cased on Tape, the book Cased, about it addresses this topic of racism. She's wondering how it helps, or he's wondering how it helps them change and be able to become aware of unaware attitudes that we absorb living in a white-dominated culture, right? And I think for
First
me,
of all,
one of those was I just assumed the way I grew up is the way everyone grew up, right? I
yeah.
think that's one of the assumptions I think many whites like me have made, that my experience was every kid grew up the way I grew up, right? In fact, that is not the case. Very much not the case. Right?
Professor Kendi over at Boston University talks about, the anti-racist baby. I think it's important for us all to be having those conversations. Like, it shouldn't just be my children that are learning that there are differences in the world. Like, all your children and grandchildren and neighbors need to understand that there's more to reality than the world that you live in. And so, providing opportunities for people to see beyond their lens, having conversations with friends and family. Kareem, as frustrating as it is, sometimes you just got to explain and you got to just share your own story. It is frustrating, but use that as, for me, I see that as God's witness for me, to share. Perhaps that's a legacy I'm leaving behind, for the world to see, to hear those connections, to make those connections. So as painful as it is, perhaps that's your witness, if you're comfortable. And if you're not, be willing to say, well, I'm tired of sharing the story. The struggle is real. So I get you completely.
And as part of our discomfort, my discomfort has to be that you and Kareem shouldn't have to be in the position of having to explain and over again. That perhaps part of our awakening is also to recognize and take more responsibility, not just to intellectually understand this information, but to be a witness to what we hear you and others sharing about your experience. Like you said, it's not just the statistics, it's the experience that matters as well, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Jackie, for reading Cast. It's on my list. I haven't gotten there yet, but it's really through learning and shaping our mindsets. And I wonder how this is helping me to change and to be able to change. Your attitudes will automatically change rather, and your conversations with your friends and family will be different. And I think that's where the starting point is, like the conversations you have at home, and challenging people's stereotypes. My God, in respectful ways, because you don't want to, especially on social media, I find myself listening a lot. I find myself reading and paying attention to what I see being thrown out, even on Catholic websites, what people have to say. Because you know what, as wrong as it may be, from my perspective, it may be wrong, but from their perspective, it may be through experience. So that's how they see the gospel. Who can blame them if they've never seen the gospel in a different way, lived out? Right? So that's that person's experience. And we pray through the Holy Spirit that that person will be given journeying accompaniment to seeing with heart. That's how I look at it. So I will not debate with anybody over social media, but I will see exactly what the points are that people are pointing out. And that's their experience. That's how they've lived and seen the gospel. But there are other ways to the reality of witness. And so I challenge all of us to seeing with heart, to be awakened, and to become more aware, to extend our circles, and to become, become friends with people who you probably wouldn't have talked to in a million years, people from the other side of the track, people who are from different experiences and cultures, people who you might have stereotyped, to be connectors, to be part of the transformation that's going to happen. And that is happening right now.
And with that, I think that's a really great note to end on it, the encouragement to see with the eyes of our heart and to take the chance to build relationships with others, especially those with whom we think it may not have been possible at all to have a relationship. But the parable of the Good Samaritan tells us otherwise. Okay, well, thank you, Sherine, and thank you for your book. And once again, the title of the book is Awakening to the Violence of Systemic Racism, and it's by our guest tonight, Sherine Green, and her co-author, Vince Gallagher. You can find it on Amazon.com. That's where I bought my copy. And as I said, it's more than just a collection of data points. It's every chapter has points of reflection, quotes from Catholic social teaching, and a series of very helpful, I think, questions for our own reflection so that we can take the very journey that Sherine has encouraged us to take. So thank you, Sherine. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And I hope you'll join us for future events here through the Office of Mission and Sponsorship at St. Joseph's College.